Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and thank you so much for listening. Thank you to those of you who have decided to support the show. You can do so at jeffersonhour.com. Click on donate. There's a number of ways to do it. We really appreciate it. While you're there, you can find out more about Clay's cultural tours, everything he's got going on, and there's a lot there.
Oh, my. It's a rough, scattered, hectic time in my life. Loving it.
You've been saying that for 2 years. No, longer.
10. How long have we been doing this? 15,
Yeah.
17, 20.
On to the show.
You've been the semi-permanent guest horse for a generation.
Yeah. Did you say horse?
I did. I meant host. Host, horse.
Like a Freudian slip. This is a really fun show. This one you did as a one-on-one conversation. You're doing more of those, and I love them. It's really fun to go back and listen to them. This was with Beau Breslin. He's an author. I'm going to leave it to you to read the title of his book.
It is a really interesting book called A Constitution for the Living, Imagining How 5 Generations of Americans would rewrite the nation's fundamental law.
And it's available?
Yeah, it's Stanford University Press. Get it from your local independent bookstore or from Amazon or Barnes & Noble and so on. But here's what's so interesting about it, David. I saw the title and I thought, that's interesting. So I ordered the book and read it and liked it a lot. Then I thought, I wonder if this guy, Beau Breslin, would submit to an interview. So I contacted him and I said, in kind of a Uriah Heep way, I said, I know how busy you must be and at the end of the semester and so on, but would you be willing sit for an interview? And he wrote back, hey, I'm a big fan of the Jefferson Hour. This is an honor. Let's do it. And so I was so flabbergasted to think that he would be
great. That's great.
And so, and we hit it off because I believe strongly that we need national renewal. That our Constitution was not meant to be a suicide pact, and in some ways it has become one.
Goodness.
Yes. I mean, take the Second Amendment.
Our Constitution, a suicide pact? I got to write that down.
It is. And this is not an original thought, by the way, but I think that we are in danger of letting a strict understanding of a Constitution written 235 years ago strangle us as a rational people, and not just on the Second Amendment. And so we need to clarify, we need to go back, we need to start fresh, we need to empower ourselves, we need a national civics lesson. And I came out of this and wrote a piece for Governing, which people can find at governing.com, in which I said the best thing we could do to honor the 250th birthday of the country, which is coming, and which is going to be a nightmare of cultural politics, of antagonism and fighting for the soul of America and blaming. It's going to be a nightmare. We should have a national constitutional convention, at least a mock one, to see if we could form a more perfect union. And that would be a national renewal instead of trying to decide what we make of the Civil War and what we make of the Espionage Act and what we make of the Alien and Sedition laws and what we make of Indian removal. I'm already weary of what's coming on the 250th, and every cultural institution, from the national endowments all the way out, are planning to spend a fortune to commemorate, in some sense, the 250th. And it doesn't look to me like it's going to be a very harmonious occasion. So I would like us to do something productive, and Beau sets that up in this extraordinary book.
That's great. And I couldn't agree with you more, but I think a wide general reaction is going to be like,
are you nuts?
You're breaking up. Yeah.
No, I mean, every time I've talked about this for 20 years or more, and every time I mention it in a public audience, people gasp and think, are you crazy? We're going to let the people, lobbyists and interests and hate groups and media, and no, we can't possibly rewrite the Constitution.
But in this conversation, you find a kindred spirit, and it's a great conversation. I think we should go to it now and once again say thanks to everybody for listening.
And people should take a look at this book, A Constitution for the Living, Imagining How 5 Generations of Americans Would Rewrite the Nation's Fundamental Law, by Mr. Beau Breslin of Skidmore College. Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. But this week, it's another one-on-one conversation between Clay Jenkinson and Beau Breslin. And Clay, tell us who he is.
I saw the title of his book, A Constitution for the Living, imagining how 5 generations of Americans would rewrite the nation's fundamental law. And I thought, this guy is some sort of a Jeffersonian. And it turns out he is. He teaches at Skidmore. He's a listener. He's a fan of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Really?
We've become good friends. I interviewed him about this. Jefferson, as you know, argued in a famous letter to Madison that we should tear up the Constitution once per generation and start over. And so Beau thought, well, what if we had? What would it look like? And so he took 5 different moments, generations in American history, and tried to posit, it's fact and fiction combined, but it's mostly fact. What would have happened had we done that? And I was so intrigued by this that I decided I want to interview this man. Contacted him. He was willing. We had a really, as you'll see, a very interesting conversation. Mostly we talked about where we are today and what sort of changes we would want, what provisions of the Constitution we would either want to address if we revised it today or would have to address as the 21st century unfolds. So that's the setup. And, I said, you're the first person I've ever met who actually takes Jefferson's idea seriously. He said, I know. It's amazing that he hasn't been treated better by historians for this, because it actually is a really good thought experiment, and it might actually be a great thing to do.
It's a great conversation, a lengthy one. We won't be able to broadcast all of it, but a great portion of it. And let's go to that now, and we'll talk more in the next segment.
So this is my conversation one-on-one with Professor Beau Breslin, A Constitution for the Living. I'm thrilled and delighted that you're willing to do this. I've got your book right here.
It's a real honor to be here, I have to say, Clay.
Just to get us started, can you just give the briefest biographical sketch and how you got to this project?
Sure. So I am a professor at Skidmore. I'm a political scientist, and I went to the University of Pennsylvania for my graduate program, in part because all of the work that I had done leading up to that had been on the Supreme Court. And I was interested, Clay, in constitutions. And Penn offered me that opportunity to study constitutions. So for the last 25 years, I have been a constitutional theorist. I would describe myself that way. I like to think about constitutions. And this project came about in a conversation I had with a student. I was sitting there thinking about Jefferson, quite frankly, thinking about the ways in which that famous debate between Jefferson and Madison about the earth belonging to the living. And I thought to myself, what would happen if Jefferson had won that debate? And so she and I started to think about kind of projecting the ways in which American history would have changed and what those constitutions would have looked like. And the amazing thing for me, Clay, is I spent 7 years as Skidmore's dean of the faculty. So I had started the project early and then came back to it when I finished, and nobody had done it. It seemed so simple to me. Like, let's just pretend we live in a Jeffersonian world, and the Constitution was rewritten every generation. It's amazing to me that nobody did the project.
Agreed. So among your works, Constitution for the Living, Imagining How 5 Generations of Americans Would Rewrite the Nation's Fundamental Law, Stanford University Press, 2021. From Words to Worlds, Examining Constitutional Functionality, Johns Hopkins, 2009. And Communitarian Constitution, Johns Hopkins, 2004. So let's start this way. Some men look on constitutions with a kind of sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human and assume what they did to be beyond amendment. We may as well require a man to wear the coat that fitted him as a child as to wear the civilized coat of his barbarous ancestors. So that's his later formulation to Samuel Kercheval. He never gave up on this idea. Madison wrote this extraordinary letter essentially crushing Jefferson's idea. Was Madison right that, all of his quibbles that how do you define a generation? Generations surely have obligations to the past and to the future. We need some majesty and credibility in constitutions. These kind of changes would weaken the majesty of the law. In your opinion, who won that debate?
Pragmatically, Madison won the debate, because here we are 230 plus years later, still talking about the Constitution, the 1789 Constitution. But Clay, to be honest, when I started this project, I was fully a Madisonian. I am not so sure I'm a Madisonian anymore, because I do not think that our Constitution is doing a good job of constituting this polity anymore. Madison won the debate because, Jefferson was unable to get the national conversation. Of course, there are many states that have these mechanisms, these sunset clauses and these mechanisms every 20 years or so on. But he was never able to convince the nation to do this. But I honestly think that there's some brilliance in Jefferson's idea that each generation ought to write its own constitution. And I do think, Clay, and I think you probably agree with this, the core of Jefferson's idea that it is just another form of tyranny for a current people to be governed by a document written either one or now 9 generations removed. That's just another form of tyranny, like tyranny of the majority, right? So Jefferson's antipathy, his angst about tyranny, I think, is right and manifested in what I think is a brilliant idea. Now, whether or not we could actually get together in 2022 or 2025 and write a good constitution, that's subject for you and I to have a conversation about. I'm not so sure about that. But that doesn't take away from the brilliance of Jefferson's idea.
Agreed. I've always felt that Jefferson deserved more serious scrutiny for this idea than he's gotten. It's usually just a kind of a throwaway. Isn't that typical of Jefferson, and so on and so forth? And we are all Madisonians in a sense.
Yeah.
But I've always wanted somebody to really take this seriously and to try to figure out, well, what could we have gained by doing this aside from consent? I mean, I get consent, of course. But if you look at the Constitution today, the Second Amendment, for example, it'd be very unlikely that a fresh Constitution could write the Second Amendment, at least as it exists. And look at us now, living under a national suicide pact, and there's no way out. I mean, the chance of undoing the Second Amendment approaches zero. And yet, if we had a constitutional convention, if you could find a way to constitute it in some representative way, it would surely have to wrestle with this question in a way that would be creative and useful, right?
I think you're absolutely right about this. And let me acknowledge right off the bat that you're more of an expert than I am about this. So I'm curious about your thoughts too. That said, I think you have the Second Amendment and the Ninth Amendment, Clay, that are equally, puzzling in a 21st century America. Let's not forget that the Second Amendment has this kind of preambulatory clause, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary, and so on. That is, for me, a defining feature of the Second Amendment. But I know it's not for folks who ignore it or don't care. For folks around the country, if you sat down and crafted a new one today, it would be very different. But I'm not sure the core features of the Second Amendment, right, this notion of a right to own guns, would go away in this highly politicized environment. In the same way, one of my real pet peeves, and I have enjoyed tremendously the last several Thomas Jefferson hours where you and Lindsay have been talking about various things related to Supreme Courts and so on. The thing that's frustrating for me is the story of the Bill of Rights is told only partially. You know this as well as anybody. Madison comes in the first Congress with 17 amendments. Only 12 make it through the congressional part, and only 10 are ultimately ratified by the states. But one of the ones that Madison is able to successfully implement, get through, write, and so on, is the Ninth Amendment. The enumeration of these rights does not deny or disparage others retained by the people. The goal of the framing and the founding generation was the expansion of liberty, not the limitation of liberty. Quite frankly, the Second Amendment is a real head scratcher for me. The Ninth Amendment is a real head scratcher for me for other reasons. Why is it that it's been largely wiped off the face of the constitutional landscape?
The total neglect of the Ninth Amendment.
That notion that the Ninth Amendment is now wiped off the landscape of constitutional interpretation is totally antithetical to not just Jefferson, but also Madison, who was like, yeah. And you write so beautifully that we kind of live in a Hamiltonian world now, but we'd like to get back to a Jeffersonian, at least, temperament. yes, we live in a Hamiltonian world. Hamilton was the one who was like, yeah, you guys are playing with fire here if you write these rights down. And ultimately, there are others that we will not only discover, but that we are endowed with. And you got to have a space for them. So a Bill of Rights is dangerous. And of course, the Anti-Federalists disagreed and opposed him. But the major players in the American founding all understood that these rights in the Bill of Rights were not the only ones we had. And so Jefferson is right about that.
To say that in another way, the founders understood that these rights do not constitute an exhaustive and final list of human right.
Correct.
Yeah. So doesn't this make for even greater irony that these jurists who call themselves originalists are so historically unsophisticated about what was intended in a republic?
That's right.
That if they were originalists, they would be fighting for the Ninth Amendment instead of ignoring the Ninth Amendment. And so it strikes me that this a couple of things. This exposes the court as increasingly a third political branch of the government rather than the thing we thought it was going to be, right?
Agreed. This notion of originalism is a fraud. And, Clay, I'll say this for your broad listeners. It's a fraud on the right, and in some sense, there is an equal fraud on the left. The fraud on the right, when it comes to constitutional interpretation, is originalism. So I think there are problems on the left and problems on the right when it comes to constitutional interpretation.
And to be fair, as you say, the left has done this as much as the right. We just happen to be in a rightist moment of the history of the court. These are honest, difficult, really complex issues in a free society, that these are political actors with life appointments.
I need to interrupt at this point and say we need to take a short break from this conversation. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, a one-on-one conversation between Clay Jenkinson and Beau Breslin. Pretty interesting fellow you found to talk to here, Mr. Jenkinson.
Yes, we've become friends. He's a man after my own heart. I've been at Jefferson now for, I suppose, 40 years, off and on, mostly on. And I remember when I began and I first came upon the idea that we should tear up the Constitution from time to time, and I was kind of flabbergasted. I thought, that sounds like chaos, which is how James Madison
probably
read
would be
too. But Beau has taken it seriously and has wondered if this kind of national renewal wouldn't actually do us a great deal of good. And so I know we can't air the entire conversation, but we talked about what it would be like to find an algorithm to select 55 or 550 delegates from around the country who would truly represent the massive variety of the American people and bring to it the time and discipline it would take to write a new constitution and what that constitution might say.
Well, it's a great conversation. I'm hearing it now for the first time as well. So let's return to it now, shall we?
Yes. Back to Jefferson for a moment here. So one of the reasons that Jefferson wanted these generational constitutional conventions is because otherwise you force the courts to be powerful. So when we look at provisions of the Constitution today, because Congress has not been clear about what it intends, because the Constitution is 234 years old, and they could not have anticipated cyber porn or a 9mm handgun or an AR-15 or the internet. This forces the judicial branch of government to take on what people like to call legislating from the bench, because we've given no other option. Somebody has to make these determinations. Jefferson wanted it to be made in a fundamental civilizational way. Because we've refused to do that, we've created a super branch of government in the judiciary. And at their best, they're uneasy with that power. At their worst, they use it in a swashbuckling way.
Absolutely true. And the thing that I would add to that, you're completely right across the board. The thing that I would add to that is Jefferson acutely understood that a judiciary as powerful as we currently see in 2022 is going to be the death knell of the democratic process, and in particular, the House of Representatives, right? So a great frustration for me is the fact that the Congress is impotent. And quite frankly, the Congress loves the fact that you have a federal judiciary who takes up the hard challenges, right? These are hard issues. But Jefferson and Madison and others never imagined that the Supreme Court would be the primary, much less the first line of defense on tough issues. And so for me, one of the things that I talk about in my book is term limits. Term limits for Congress members would be phenomenally advantageous for our country. Secondly, the Senate being an undemocratic, the most undemocratic legislative institution in perhaps the world, right? Where California has two senators, yet 40 times the representation, the number of citizens as Wyoming. The Senate's power is way too significant. So one of the things that I would do in order to lower the power of the courts is take down the power of the Senate, give enormous amount of power to the House of Representatives, give the Senate some things. I don't think you get rid of the Senate, but give the Senate some powers, but not nearly as much as it has now. Make the House of Representatives truly a representative institution, and you take down the power of the courts because it would force the House of Representatives to be making tough decisions. Right now, it's easy for them to either defer to the other branches of government or in particular, to the Supreme Court.
So we're sort of talking about your proposals for constitutional change, and I want to hear more about that. But just to dwell on this for a moment, Beau, not only is the Senate profoundly unrepresentative in that California has 40 million people and North Dakota has 760,000, and we each have 2 senators. I mean, I get why this happened. And the founding fathers not only did it, but they embedded that power, which is impossible to conceive of. Another reason to start over. But it's worse, right? Because not only is there that profound problem at the heart of the Senate, but we also have created a supermajority system in the filibuster. So the heart of America for Jefferson is majority rule. The Senate is already an elite body designed to be the dish of tea that Washington talked about to slow things down. If you give it the filibuster, you're essentially giving it a stranglehold on progressive change of any sort.
That's right. You're giving it a veto. I don't think Jefferson ever imagined the Senate would be as both powerful and dysfunctional as it currently is. Jefferson would want us to think about the ways in which now is the time to rethink a lot of these things. So what's frustrating for me, Clay, and thinking about Jefferson is if we had had generational constitutional change, even if it had been, okay, we're going to hold on to the main structure of the original 1787 document, and we're going to tinker with it in convention every 19 years as Jefferson wanted, or we blew the whole thing up and started over again, you would have had an evolutionary process. And no, we probably would not have gone from our current bicameral legislature to a parliamentary system. I don't think anywhere along the way we would have gone from that, but you would have had the management of difficult moments structurally in which those would have been taken care of in a Jeffersonian world every 19 years. That would have made a difference in 2022. But right now we're stuck with a constitution that reflects late 18th century mentality.
It reflects it, but it also distorts it, I think. And that's what you've been saying, that, that Jefferson would not recognize the Senate as it's currently constituted. But as you know, probably better than anyone, the American people are surprisingly small c conservative about their constitution. So take just 2 things. One is the filibuster, and the other are 9 members of the Supreme Court.
Right.
People don't understand their constitution, I don't think, but to the extent that they do, they regard those as unalterable.
Sacred.
But of course, they're not unalterable. They're arbitrary. And so we could have 300 justices or 3 or anything in between. But these norms have achieved semi-constitutional status, and the American people show deep reluctance to adjust those things. And so that's on them, right?
Correct. So how long has it been? 150 years since we've had 9? But this is one of the rare instances, Clay, where you and I disagree, because I actually think you mentioned in a previous session that you would stick with an odd number. I think we ought to have an even number of justices. And the reason why I think we ought to have an even number of justices is that it forces a majority opinion to be separated by more than a single vote.
It's like tennis. You have to win by 2.
Exactly. So, and I think that makes a difference when you think about the Bush versus Gores of the world, right? Or the some of the recent cases that we talked about, that you guys have talked about in the last year, in the last term. So I do think if you have 10, you have to have at least 7 in the majority in order or 6-4 in the majority in order to make it work. So I would be in favor of an even number, but you're right. 9 has somehow become sacred for some unknown reason.
You made 2 proposals here about the court. One is 18-year terms, and the second is let's increase the number, but make it even. How do we get there from here? If you said to me, how do we get there from here? I would say impossible.
Okay, so I think it actually is impossible because, you have the Biden commission who talked about fixed terms and so on. And that went in executive branch's drawer and nobody's paying any attention to it. So I don't think the political landscape is receptive to any significant change on the Supreme Court. But let's imagine that it is. How do you get there from here? I do like the idea of a president getting 2 picks automatically. Let's eliminate the Merrick Garland problem, right? Let's eliminate the Amy Coney Barrett problem of, well, it just matters who controls the Senate if you're going to get your person through. So give each president 2 picks. What I would say is if you and I are sitting in convention today, I would argue that the 18-year clock starts now for Supreme Court justices. You start the clock now, and then over time, in the next 18 years, you eventually start the opportunity for a president to be able to nominate 2 justices per term. I think that makes a whole lot of sense. I'm not a big fan of the commission, but I do think you try to make it as nonpartisan as possible. My answer to that would be lower the power of the Senate and make the House of Representatives more powerful, and may even be the branch that confirms important Supreme Court justices, federal court justices, judges, and so on. But I think that's the way you do it.
So much there, Beau. One question is just an observation. I think you're describing a change that would make us a little bit more, not parliamentary, but a little bit more like House of Representatives as the Commons, and then the Senate almost as the House of Lords that does judicial appointments and treaties and so on.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's right.
That makes sense. Again, so that's my second question. Get there from here. I despair of adjusting the Second Amendment. I despair of reinvigorating the Ninth. I despair of reforming the Senate. I despair of judicial reform. And Jefferson understood this. This is his genius. You can't get there from within the monopoly game. You have to clear the board, wipe it clean, and start over. Do you think, here's the test of Jefferson, and you too, do you think if we had a constitutional convention, if somehow we could put it together, that they would then be able to get to these reforms? In other words, the test of Jefferson is, does it work? It's one thing to have the convention, but if you can't build the reforms then either, then it was a mistaken idea, right?
Well, I'm going to, Clay, with all due respect, I'm going to dance around that question a little bit.
Good.
And that is one of the things that makes this the most exciting conversation for me is the times in which we live. I do not believe that we would have the type of reforms we need if we sat in Philadelphia in the next 4 months and tried to bang something out. We're not in a good enough space.
And we haven't read our Plutarch and Montesquieu either.
Yeah, right. That said, let me be an optimist here. I do think this is a temporary moment in my lifetime. I'm 56. So in my lifetime, this is a temporary moment. It is, I think, the worst political moment of my lifetime too. And I think you agree with that. But I also think that had we been heeding Jefferson's advice and at least had 1 or 2 conventions up till now, we would be in a situation to welcome more progressive, or what I would describe as radical change. You are right. I'll finish here. You are right that framers are small c conservatives. They're going to gravitate to the middle. We don't need the gravitation to the middle, because that's just tinkering with the edges at the moment. We need some real significant, progressive, interesting, radical ideas. And I think the time will come. Right now is not that time.
So how broken are we? Are we broken? Are we flawed? I mean, to take all the time you want, how broken are we in 2022?
I do think we are approaching Rome at the end of its republic.
I was about to mention Rome. I think we are too. We have militias attacking our capital. We have private armies.
That's right. Do I think we are irretrievably broken? No, I don't. Because I think right now, maybe things will be different in 2025 if things continue to slide. But I do think we can still recover parts of what was, I think, a really solid republic for a while, right? So one of the problems I think we face, and this is a topic of conversation, is the media. So how does the media contribute to what is a flawed regime, right? Well, one of the reasons why the media contributes this way is they tend to highlight those things that point out our flaws. Are there moments where there are good politics happening? Yes. They tend to be at the local and sometimes at the state level, which we tend to ignore. I'm not saying that the media should gravitate to, the school board meetings and the city council meetings, but boy, there's some real debate that goes on in those moments that just never sees the light of day. And so this bickering that happens in our tribal society right now that gets the attention of the media is contributing to this kind of perpetuation of us having a broken political system. One thing that's fascinating, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is, I read yesterday, folks are frustrated with the White House because Biden has always tried to walk a fine bipartisan line, right? He's not trying to be, as much as he can, anti-Republican with a big R, with a capital R. And yet politics these days it's a zero-sum game. The only way you win is by cutting your opponent off at the knees. That's not the way Jefferson saw politics. And he was probably ashamed of the way in which, I think I read from you, he was ashamed of the way in which he treated Adams in 1800 for that particular election. Getting back to a Jeffersonian way where civic life was the greatest of all virtues, and your commitment to the public realm, to the res publica, was much more important than your commitment to your own passions and interests and so on. I think if we recover even a little bit of that, we'll get out of this mire and start walking upwards.
I know I sound like I'm the pessimist in this conversation. How do you recover civic virtue and civic religion when we have reached this point of debasement?
Yeah, so I think I think the only way you do it is incentivize it and value it. I think people need practice, national public service. Sometime, I think you said sometime between 18 and 25. I would probably narrow it between. You have to enter into national public service sometime between 18 and 20. Doesn't have to be the military, but national public service, you have to learn the skills of what it means to have a higher purpose. And I don't want to sound Pollyannish here. Like, you've inspired me in so many ways. I don't want to sound Pollyannish, but I also want to recognize that it makes a difference when you are in the AmeriCorps or the military or Teach for America or some of these programs where you're giving back for 2 years and there is a higher purpose. So I think that's one of the ways in which we can make civic virtue a much more important part of our everyday lives.
It seems to me that that's slightly more doable than the other things that we're proposing. In other words, I could see some modified, limited form of national service becoming a policy of the United States.
Okay.
I don't think that's an impossibility. I don't think it's going to happen, but I don't think that it's an impossibility. So first of all, I want to just say we agree on almost every subject. When you're talking, before you mentioned national service, it was sitting at the top of my head. Civic, are we Rome? That was sitting at the top of my head. That's dangerous when two people agree as much as we're doing. What did you learn? How does it play out for you when you actually try to do this?
The soaring language of Jefferson's Declaration in the beginning. We don't spend as much time talking about the laundry list of complaints that he has. But I think one of the most important lines that goes to the question of civic virtue is the last line that he writes, right? For the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Jefferson put sacred honor at the end for a reason. It was more important to him than lives and our fortunes.
We need to take a short break from this one-on-one conversation between Clay Jenkinson and Beau Breslin. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, our third and final segment of a one-on-one conversation between Beau Breslin and Clay Jenkinson. And let's return to this conversation.
Thank you.
So what did I learn? Well, first of all, I learned that when you play out Jefferson's idea of generational constitutions, you have to understand that Constitutional Convention framers, delegates, are going to most likely resolve issues that are right in front of them. So let's take 1825, right? As you know from the book, I took the spirit of Jefferson and the spirit of his idea, and I took the average life expectancy as my years. So my first constitutional convention is 1825. Well, of course, they're going to think about the Electoral College because John Quincy Adams' election of 1824 was a disaster, right? So the one thing I learned is that it's most likely the things that are immediately in front of them are the ones that are going to get most attention. That may not be a great thing when we're talking about kind of a thoughtful reconstruction of a constitutional document, but it's likely that would happen. The other thing I learned is that it matters who's in the room. When I'm doing 1825 play, 1863, 1903, 1953, I'm using historical figures who I imagine would have been in the room. The Daniel Websters in 1825, the Booker T. Washingtons in 1903, and so on. I'm using those figures and what they stood for, but it matters who's in the room. So it was a fascinating experiment to think of, when do people of color enter into the conversation? When do women enter into the conversation, right? Women would not have been invited for any of the 19th century constitutional conventions. And probably not even the 1903 one, although women's suffrage was a major thing. So who's in the room makes a difference.
It would be impossible to conceive of a constitutional convention in the United States today that wasn't broadly representative of the different groups, genders, religious outlooks, and so on of American life. I think we've understood that inclusion is essential to the democratic process, even if we're imperfectly embodying it.
I think you're absolutely right about that. What would be interesting is how we think about interest group involvement. Larry Sabato, great University of Virginia faculty member, just a huge thinker, as you know, he said, if you're going to have a constitutional convention now, make it kind of a citizen delegation. So the Beau Breslins and the Clay Jenkinsons of the world have just as much of a shot, if not more of a shot, than the politicians in Washington. I think that's smart. And what I write in the book is, if you had a constitutional convention now, it's obviously not going to be 55 delegates. It's got to be a significant amount more. But what if you put together 435 that were citizens, and then each state legislature got to pick two quote unquote experts, so that you had somebody who kind of knows, like the Madison of the world, who kind of knows what it means to craft a constitution. Clay, you could be one of the two experts that comes from North Dakota, right? And I have no doubt that you'd be seriously considered for that. But you got to have some expertise, but the majority have to be citizens. And I think at the end of the day, if you have enough people, you'd have enough representation. I've done talks like this across the country over the last year, and a lot of folks have challenged me by saying things like, well, after January 6th, how can you be assured that certain people are not going to be invited? Well, at the end of the day, we may not agree on things like the Second Amendment and so on. And maybe I'm too much of an optimist, Clay. But at the end of the day, I do not believe the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys would be selected or elected into the convention. They may have influence, they may protest and so on, but I don't think those folks are going to be in there. I think it's more rational people, which strikes me as probably a smart move. But again, we gravitate to the center because we're so polarized at the moment.
Whenever, and in the course of 30 years, whenever I've talked about this in public, the immediate reaction of everybody is, "Oh my God, we couldn't. We never. This would be worse. We'd ruin it. Are you kidding?" And it always really disappoints me because I think Jefferson would say, "Well, if you think that, then you don't deserve to be in a free society, right? If you despair that the people couldn't do this."
Right.
And I think people do discipline themselves when they're in situations like this. You'd obviously have some outliers. Do you think that there is a computer algorithm that could give us 435? So give us the two from each state. That's fine.
Yep.
You think there's an algorithm that could find a representative sample of Americans? You might say they have to have a high school degree. I don't know. But do you think it could be done?
Yes, I do think it could be done. I don't think it would be easy, and there would be all sorts of politics surrounding the list when it came out. But I do think it can be done, and I think it can be done relatively easily. The question is it like jury duty where if you get selected, are you able to say, oops, don't want to do it this time, I'll do it next time? I don't know. We'd have to work out those details.
Would you rather have an elective or jury duty?
My argument would be if you start to enter in the question of campaigning for positions, you start to enter dangerous territory. One of the things that I thought was interesting, you asked me again what I learned about thinking about our Constitution in a Jeffersonian way, is how do you take, say, the Equal Protection Clause and reframe it to be powerful enough in the 21st century so that you don't get, some of the, so that it becomes a tool and a weapon for racial issues in this country. Because right now, the Equal Protection Clause has been helpful in some ways, but not helpful in others. How do you retool an existing constitutional clause so that it actually can be a powerful tool? That's something that I would love to have a convention wrestle with. It may take 4 months just alone to talk about race, but I think it's worthy of the conversation. I just worry that they wouldn't touch it.
I'm more of a Jeffersonian optimist than maybe you are. I think if you had an algorithm that chose these people and they met in secrecy and they hammered these questions, I think that they would adjust the Second Amendment. I think they would say, everyone has a right to guns, of course.
Right.
But there needs to be universal background checks, and certain types of weapons are obviously weapons of war, and they would limit that. I think that would be hard. It would be shouting matches, but I think that in the end, that the will of the people is more enlightened than our Constitution, which is where we started.
Right. I
think they would clarify this, and they would remove the militia clause because we don't have a militia, and therefore we don't really need a Second Amendment. But that's water under the bridge. Secondly, I think that we would wrestle with race, and I think we would say something like, we're rewriting the 14th Amendment, and this time we mean it. Yeah. It does include African Americans. There will be penalties for violating this. That you can't twist this in ways that allow black codes. I think we could tighten the 14th Amendment and then nobody could slip around it. They would have to, well, it's obvious. The convention said you cannot discriminate in these ways. Because I think Clarence Thomas and Alito at least would undo the civil rights acts if they could, which is pretty profound, awful thing to say. Third, I think that we would adjust the Senate. I think that the American people don't think about this because they're busy living their lives. But I think that if we had a constitutional convention and we said, okay, the Senate made sense in 1787, sort of. Does it make sense when California is larger than the population of the United States was then by 5 times or by 8 times? I think we would adjust it. And I have a plan for 100 senators. Some states get 5, other states get 4, mid states get 3, North Dakota gets its 1, Wyoming gets its 1. You could easily limit the Senate to 100 and give California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, 5, 4, 3, somewhere in there. Give the bottom tier their mandatory 1. But I think you could do that. And I think you could hammer that out. In other words, I think that Jefferson was right, that there are things that can't be done by routine legislation. B, the amendment bar has been set too high and we're just stuck with that. Totally. C, so we're not going to amend our way out of this. And the last amendment was a frivolous one about congressional salaries. 1992, 2 generations ago, or at least one. C, you can't do it, or B, you can't do it by routine legislation. C, when you crack it open, as we saw in the Canadian Constitutional Convention, they solved the problem of Quebec. They solved the federal balance. They brought Native peoples in a huge way that could never have happened through routine legislation. I believe that enlightenment happens and that these 435 people would actually be a better measure of the national will than the United States Congress, which is pretty awful to think about. But so I'm an optimist. I think we could. Now, some things aren't going to get ever fixed, right? There's always going to be racism in America, but you can make it harder for there to be racists in America. And it's always going to be money in our politics, but you could make it a lot better restraining the power of money in our elections, in our politics than we now have. But you're not going to get there through Congress, right? Ever.
That's true. I am so fired up by your idea.
But don't you think that this is true, that Jefferson was right, that the people, look, think of your plan for the House. If the Senate were reduced to some other things, the House would pass a National Voting Rights Act, and has. The House would pass reasonable gun restraints, and has. If you think of the number of things that the House has done on environment, on race, on gender, on the place of money in American life, on the right to vote unimpeded, they've already done all that work.
Right.
And the veto didn't come from the Supreme Court. The veto came from North Dakota senators, Wyoming senators, Alaska senators, Alabama senators, Arkansas senators. Right. So you could do this, but you have to try. And so maybe a modified approach to this, Beau, would be to have a national constitutional initiative around the celebration that was not necessarily going to be binding. In other words, that this would be an exercise that might turn out to be something you want to. I think that the American people would be very frightened of actually giving them the power to do it.
Yeah.
But if you made it an exercise and this was part of our national celebration, I think you would show that people are largely high-minded when they get in a room.
I agree. I think that's a really good way of doing it. One of the things that I think is interesting that you mentioned so much in your level of sophistication. One of the things that I think is so interesting is a lot of the original compromises, right, that were in the original constitutional document, and the most obvious being the 3/5 compromise, have largely gone away. Why isn't it that the bicameral Senate, which was a compromise, right, out of Connecticut, why haven't we tinkered with that? Those are, why is that sacred, but some of the other compromises in the Constitution have been amended out of? And you're absolutely right about Canada. They were able to constitutionalize French-speaking Canadians so that they were recognized in their constitutional document. We should do the same in at least the preamble, if not in the body of the text.
Last question for today. At some point during this process, you must have asked yourself certain questions like, what am I doing here? I'm writing fiction that includes historical figures, and this is going to be this book's going to have its own strange niche. And secondly, were there times when you were writing this when you thought, I see that Madison was actually right here, that Jefferson, there are strengths and weaknesses to Jefferson's plan?
Well, I think that so I think the I'll take them in reverse order.
Good.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think there are probably moments where you think Madison was probably right. I mean, structurally, I think there are parts of the Constitution that still work, and that Madison, the enduring Constitution has been a source of stability in places, right? So I do think there are aspects of Madison's idea that still resonate. No question about it.
I feel, Beau, that we can't go on. We're in an unsustainable situation here. The American people want government to deliver, government can't deliver. And the courts in their conservative new supermajority are also going to really gut the administrative state, which I think is actually constitutionally sound, but it eliminates another possibility of reform. And so we're stuck here. And these reforms that you're talking about, I mean, there are some people whose oxes are gored, but this doesn't ruin America. This saves America.
No, it's not so radical as to cause deep controversy. What's radical, Clay, is the idea of altering the Constitution. People can't wrap their minds around that.
So I close with some men look on constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant. That's where we are.
That's where we are.
Jefferson, for all that's wrong with Jefferson, and there's lots that's wrong with Jefferson, he nailed this.
He did.
And it's not that his solution of tearing up the Constitution is necessarily the right one, but he said, you're going to get into exactly this position if you cling to this thing as some sort of sacred writ. And so the founding fathers, for all of their checks and balances and so on, weren't able to fix this because it takes that civic virtue element also. So we're in a pickle. And I think at least if every person teaching constitutional law or constitutional history read your book, it would be a great provocation to this conversation.
Yeah, I hope that I'm glad you think that. Ultimately, I just want to contribute to a conversation like we're having here. And, it would be an amazing opportunity for us to do a constitutional convention. At the end of the day, I'll finish where I started, which was Jefferson's idea is a brilliant idea, right? The fact that we adopted Madison's idea doesn't mean that Jefferson wasn't right back in late 18th century, and that periodic constitutional conventions would have been a better strategy for us in the current state of affairs.
Even if Madison could appear today, even he would say, are you nuts? Are you still using this 18th century instrument?
Agreed. That's the irony of it.
Thank you so much. This was a perfect day. I really appreciate our conversation. See you soon.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Interesting conversation with Beau Breslin. We're going to have more conversations. We both agreed that even if there is not a constitutional convention in our time, it would be great to have some mock constitutional conventions. And maybe the best way to commemorate the 250th birthday of the United States in 2026 would be to attempt to rewrite the Constitution of the United States for what Lincoln might have called a rebirth of American civic consciousness. More conversations with Beau Breslin to come. Join us next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.